Hello and welcome to Douglas Week 2025. We're really happy that you're joining us online here on YouTube today for this very special Douglas Dialogues conversation. My name is, you might know it after 5 years. My name is Dr. Caroline Dunham-Schroeder. I'm the president of the Globe Lane Initiative. This is the organization that brings you Douglas Week every year. And today, in my opinion, we turn to a very fascinating comparison in 19th century political thought, how Karl Marx and Frederick Douglass each understood and responded to the meaning and stakes of the American Civil War as it unfolded. And obviously, there's so much more to this discussion because our discussion is inspired by a recent book called The Communist and the Revolutionary Liberal in the Second American Revolution, comparing Karl Marx and Frederick Douglass in real time. And that's out through Haymarket. So make sure that you check it out. And the book explores how these two towering figures, one in Europe and one in the United States, offered radical and sometimes converging analysis of slavery, freedom, and revolution. And obviously, I'm not here to tell you about this, but we have two guests, and we're very honored to welcome the authors of this book, Professor August H. Nimtz and Kyle A. Edwards, both distinguished scholars from the University of Minnesota. But Jack, our other guest, will introduce them in a minute, and he will also be guiding our discussion throughout. And if you don't know, or those of you who don't know Jack yet, let me take a moment to introduce him properly. Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan. He's the Mary O'Brien Gibson Professor of History and Africana Studies at Indiana University, Indianapolis. He is a distinguished historian of 19th century America, and his scholarship has focused on the history of enslavement, abolitionism, and reform movements. And through many of the things that he does, but also through the role as editor of the Frederick Douglass Papers, a really like a landmark project. You should check it out. He has helped preserve and share Douglass's writings with scholars, as well as the wider public. And over the course of Jack's career, which is long and absolutely amazing, Jack has authored and edited numerous influential works that have shaped how I would say generations of students and readers understand the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. So we are honored to have you all here today. And on behalf of the Douglass Week team, thank you again all for being with us today. And please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan, Professor August Nimtz, and Kyle Edwards here to the show. Jack, I'll hand over to you now to introduce our guests today. And I thank you all very much for being here.
All right. Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all the organizers behind the At Douglass Week. I've been happy to be part of this program for several years now, and it's always been a great way to reach out to the public, and it always really enheartens me to find out just how many people around the world are really interested in Frederick Douglass and view his legacy as still relevant to us today. So let me start by maybe giving you a little bit of background about the Frederick Douglass Papers, which Caroline mentioned to you. This is a scholarly research project begun in 1973 by Professor John W. Blassingame, an eminent African-American scholar at Yale University. And this project has been ongoing ever since 1973. The goal was to gather, edit, and publish initially a selected print edition of Douglass's speeches, autobiographies, correspondence, and journalistic writings. And this project has been, again, going on for over a half century. Sadly, John Blassingame died in 2001, and I had been working with him already at that time, but then I took over the project from him. And we are actually in the final straight of the original 15 volumes envisioned by Blassingame. We have now 12 in print. 13th will be out next year, and only 2 to go. So the end is in sight, unless, well, you all know what's happening in Washington. we'll see how that impacts our publication schedule, but we're determined to finish that. We're also in the process of creating a digital edition of Douglass, which is going to be shipped from the highly selected or selective print edition to as close as we can come to a comprehensive edition of all of Douglass's speeches and correspondence. We're not so sure about the editorials, since happily the Library of Congress has made issues of Douglass's newspapers kind of readily available in a good quality, easily accessible public source. But we're determined to bring the speeches and correspondence similarly to the public, and we're also really insistent on doing a free public access source for this, so which is challenging to say the least with events going on around us. The project also has a annual online scholarly journal called the New North Star, named after Douglass's first newspaper. And through that is where I first came into contact with Karl. And Karl contributed a very good article to one of our issues a couple of years ago. And I see now how that was a part of this much bigger research project that he and August had already begun. And it's come out now. I'm happy to, I got an advanced copy. I have a big PDF. I'm going to buy that paperback because carrying around that PDF is not very convenient. But I do keep it handy for reference. It's proven very useful to me. But it came out, following what was a great proliferation of studies that marked Douglass's 200th, if you will, 200th birthday in 2018. So your book demonstrates that despite all that scholarship and much of it of really high quality, there is still a lot more perspectives that can be brought to study Frederick Douglass and really illuminate issues that I don't think people have devoted nearly enough attention to. So I really encourage people to read this work and rethink maybe some of the ways they have looked at Frederick Douglass by comparing him. And it's kind of remarkable to an exact contemporary, at least born in the same year, right? 2008 or 2018, 1818. So I'm going to let our authors take the first part of the show to just kind of summarize this very interesting research they have. And then I'm going to come back and ask them some follow-up questions. So I think, August, you were going to go first. Yes.
Yes, Jack. Once again, Kyle and I are very indebted to you and very appreciative of everything you've done in helping us with this project and arranging this event. Let me begin by saying a little bit about how this book project came into existence. 25 years ago this year, I published a book called Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough. The central argument of that book is that Marx and Engels, no two individuals, had done as much to advance the democratic quest in the 19th century as did Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. That was the main claim of the book. And implicit in that claim is comparison. If I'm saying that no two individuals did more, then I must have some other people in mind. I did a limited comparison on a leading figure in that moment in the democratic quest in the 19th century, and that was Alexis de Tocqueville, because both de Tocqueville and Marx and Engels were protagonists in different kinds of ways in the 1848 revolutions. I also said, well, I should say that my main finding in that book was that the in that comparison is that Marx and Engels had better democratic credentials by a long shot than Alexis de Tocqueville. I said in that book that I needed to compare someone else from that era, and that would be John Stuart Mill. But I never got around to John Stuart Mill until about 2017. And the scenario for that comparison was the US Civil War. And again, with the Tocqueville comparison, that was for the 1848, 1849 revolutions of European Spring. And so by the time I got to the Mill comparison, I had developed a methodology, which as far as I know is original, what I call real-time political analysis. And what I argue is that the real test for political perspective are how people make decisions in the moment. Monday morning quarterbacking, hindsight, we can all look smart, but the real test for political perspective is making decisions in the moment, what I call real-time political analysis, and therefore comparing people who are making decisions in the moment. So I did the Mill comparison, and Marx proved to have better credentials, democratic credentials than Mill, because mainly Marx was willing to put in the time and the energy to advance the democratic quest, specifically to defend the Union in the face of criticisms and so on in England. Mill and Marx were on the same political page, on the same, unlike Marx and de Tocqueville, but Mill and Marx were on the same political page, but Marx was willing to put in more time and effort to do so. Well, some of the feedback I got from the comparison, I got good feedback, but it was also pointed out, perhaps I was not being fair to John Stuart Mill, because Mill never pretended to be a political activist. The Civil War politicized him, and he became a member of Parliament for the first time for a couple of years. That's why he became a political activist because of the Civil War. But sort of, I took the criticism to mind, and I thought about it and so on. In the meantime, a former student of mine named Kyle Edwards was in touch with me, and he happened to be reading one of the books you talked about, Jack, of 2018, David Blight's magisterial volume, Prophet of Freedom. And so Kyle knew I was doing the John Stuart Mill comparison. And so he kept asking questions about, well, what about Marx and Douglass? Do you have anything to say about Marx and given what Douglass was saying and doing? And so the questions kept piling up. And I said, look, I really don't know the answer. Why don't we get together and then maybe let's write an article? And so I said, I was still working on the other book. And I said, Kyle, why don't you come up with a narrative to look at what Douglass was doing in comparison to at the same moment and so on that Marx was doing things and writing and so on. So Kyle came back a few months later with about a 300-page narrative. I said, "Oh boy," I said, Kyle is in the writing mode. I said, "All right, looks like we've got a major project ahead of us." And so it was out of that, with Kyle taking the leadership in the vanguard on this, that this project really got off the ground. And we had a division of labor. Because of my prior work on Marx, I would focus mainly on what Marx and Engels were doing, and Kyle would take on Douglass. Neither of us claimed any kind of expertise in Douglass, so we are forever indebted to you and other Douglass scholars, really, really coming through, taking the time, your patience and so on, working with us to make what I think is a book that, if it has merit, with regards, especially with regard to Douglass, it's because of the scholarship, the collegiality of people like you and other Douglass scholars. So I'll let Kyle proceed.
Well, August took most of the words out of my mouth in terms of Jack, the help you gave us getting this book published, answering our questions, pointing us to the right sources, and of course the work you've done compiling and publishing the Frederick Douglass Papers. And thank you for organizing this. We jumped at the chance to be part of Douglass Week, so thank you for hosting us. And then in terms of our book, yeah, we argue that the U.S. Civil War should be seen as a delayed chapter in the European Spring, the 1848-49 revolutions that August mentioned. And significant for Douglass about the 1848 upheavals, which he covered and followed closely, is that they gave him license to begin changing his politics, moving towards an advocacy of voting, elections, and even violence. He became increasingly open through the 1850s to John Brown's project and was willing to aid and abet the also consequential raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And in enabling Brown, Douglass made his greatest achievement, we argue, to ending American slavery. But the 1848 upheavals also revealed that for Douglass, violence was permissible only in the service of the liberal, but not the proletarian cause, Marx's cause as a participant in those revolutions, which also anticipated Douglass's post-Civil War politics. While Douglass lauded the 1848 revolts for instituting republican governments and abolishing slavery, importantly in the fresh West Indies, Marx did all he could to ensure that the revolts would become permanent or socialist revolutions. Exactly what Douglass opposed and denounced when the Chartists in England and the workers in France, Paris specifically, went into motion in April and June. Throughout the 1850s, Douglass fluctuated between advocating for independent abolitionist political action through the Liberty and Radical Abolitionist parties and supporting a broader, lesser evil anti-slavery coalition like the Free Soil and Republican parties. Marx, on the other hand, after advocating for electoral coalitions with liberals in Europe against monarchists during those revolutions, became a steadfast proponent of independent working class political action. Despite all these differences, Douglass and Marx quickly found themselves on the same political page when the slave owners made their fateful decision in April 1861 to attack Fort Sumter. Coming to the aid of the Union became both of their number one priorities. But they converged for the first time for different reasons. For Douglass, the war was the best opportunity yet to abolish slavery. Marx, too, was an abolitionist, but not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, to bring modern capitalist relations of production into full bloom in America, the prerequisite for creating the force that could overthrow capitalism, a hereditary proletariat or working class. Exactly for that reason did Marx's comrades in America immediately sign up to join the Union Army after campaigning for the Republicans in both 1856 and 1860. Both Douglass and Marx agreed that despite Lincoln's protests, the war was really about the future of slavery. Douglass made relentless calls for Lincoln to enlist black men to be part of the fight in his speeches and in his newspaper, and he even blamed Lincoln's reluctance for the European rulers' backhanded endorsement of the Confederacy. For Marx, on the other hand, the task was to counter the misinformation being promoted by the generally pro-Confederate press in Britain about the nature of the war. It meant having to make a case for the abolitionist character of the war, despite, again, Lincoln's claims to the contrary. At his disposal to do so were importantly the New York Daily Tribune, which were read by both Lincoln and Douglass. He also had a liberal organ in Vienna called Die Presse. Lincoln's decision to make the war one to abolish slavery, driven in part by enslaved people themselves escaping to Union lines and the efforts of activists like Douglass, his decision started with a plan for gradual emancipation and compensated emancipation and culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863. These events saw a convergence between Douglass and Marx as never before and never again. After analyzing Lincoln's moves against both General George McClellan and slavery in the spring of 1862, and then later the fall midterm elections, Marx's confidence in Lincoln and the success of the Union cause was unwavering. In the 1862 midterms, one of the Republican Party's slogans was emancipation of the slaves. While there were setbacks after that election, including vicious race baiting from Northern Democrats, Republicans remained firmly in power and Lincoln would not turn back. Douglass, like Marx, thought the Emancipation Proclamation was the most important document to which an American president ever signed their name. As Marx put it, the manifesto abolishing slavery is the most important document in American history since the establishment of the Union, tantamount to the tearing up of the old American Constitution. Douglass was a keen observer of the dynamics between race and class, and some of his observations, which we learned about through this study, we think have relevance to politics today. Back in 1853, Douglass told an interracial audience, quote, that prejudice and hate are excited against the black worker. Enmity is stirred up between him and other laborers. Irish immigrants specifically were instantly taught on arriving to this Christian country to hate and despise the colored people. Douglass was sure, though, that the Irish Americans will find out his mistake one day. And then at an anti-slavery convention in Cincinnati the next year, Douglass posited that the 3 million people in the South who did not own slaves will, quote, in time, by the aid of education and enlightenment, come to see that the slaveholders' humiliation is necessary for the elevation of the slave and themselves. They see that white slaveholders are against them as much as they are against the slaves. Labor, white and black, must fall or flourish. He understood that the racial prejudices that white labor had at the time, these prejudices were not immutable. Instead, this was a terrain of struggle. Another unexpected find during the war in February 1862, Douglass made a class-based case to explain racial prejudice. He claimed that the experience of black people in America was not singular. Quote, whenever and wherever any particular variety of the human family, having been enslaved by another, their enslavers and oppressors in every instance have found their best apology for their own base conduct in the bad character of their victims. Not only the current victims of chattel slavery, black Americans, but also, Douglass said, the Jews, the Indians, the Saxons, and the ancient Britons have all had a taste of this bitter experience. Douglass understood that enslaving someone, a material economic relationship, led to their dehumanization, not necessarily the other way around. And then finally on this point, I'm gonna do a longer quote. I hope you'll indulge me, from a February 1863 speech at the Cooper Institute. And we think this is the closest Douglass ever came to Marx politically, specifically on the social class and racial slavery nexus in America. Douglass said, and I quote, the white laborer has been deluded into the belief that to degrade the black laborer is to elevate the white. We shall learn that labor will always be degraded where idleness is the badge of respectability. Where did the degrading phrases come from, fast growing popular before the war, such as hireling labor, greasy mechanics, the mudsills of society, that labor should be owned by the capitalist, poor white trash? Douglass said they came from slavery. The war of the rebels is a war of the rich against the poor. Let slavery go down with the war, and let labor cease to be fettered, chained, flogged, and branded. Let it be paid honest wages for honest work, and then we shall see as never before the laborers in all sections of this country rising to respectability and power. Marx would have agreed with about 90% of that, we think, but the last two sentences show where their divergences might have been. Marx believed that labor in white skin could not be emancipated while labor in black skin was branded. He counseled the American people to remove every shackle from freedom's limb to complete the victory of Reconstruction. Yet, with the surrender of the Confederacy, Marx and Douglass went their separate ways. For the Marx Party, providing the freed people with both the right to vote and the lands of their former slaveholders was indispensable for their effective freedom. For Douglass, as he's been saying for a number of years, suffrage was the panacea. When radical Republican Thaddeus Stevens proposed in September 1865 a confiscation and redistribution of former plantation lands, Douglass, like most Republicans, was silent, a stance he would come to regret decades later. Joseph Weidemeyer, who was the most important contact of Marx in America, on the other hand, advocated in September 1865 in a German-language newspaper Why not transfer all the lands that have been abandoned, confiscated, or forfeited to free Negroes to cultivate independently? This was at odds with what August calls voting fetishism, which Douglass promoted. And I believe August will get into that later, hopefully, in our question and answer. Douglass wrote during the war that suffrage would be the keystone to the arch of human liberty. Or, as far back as 1847, he wrote in a letter to Garrison that universal suffrage would mean that people and not property shall govern. Tragically, that wasn't the case. And even with universal suffrage today, property still governs. But due to the success of the proletarian-led Second Reconstruction, or the Civil Rights or Freedom Now movement, we are in a better position now than ever before to create a transracial alliance of workers to fight for human emancipation. So again, thank you for having us here, for letting us talk about our project. And Jack, we really look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you. And thank you for that optimistic last comment about the future. Yes, it's hard to be optimistic some days when unless you turn off your television or your radio. Yeah, I'm really excited about this book, even when I was first told about it, because Douglass has actually been the subject of other dual biographies. John Stauffer and James Oates both created dual biographies of Douglass with Abraham Lincoln, and not surprisingly, in both cases, they labeled Douglass the radical, and Lincoln the more cautious conservative person. Now you've kind of flipped the script in a very interesting way to compare Douglass with Karl Marx. And I thought the title was very useful. It gives away the thesis when you labeled Douglass a revolutionary liberal. I mean, that's such a great capsule description of his politics. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you. Looking back, I think the title might be a little bit too long, so I'm glad that that it worked for you. But yeah, Douglass was a liberal social reformer, and we would argue the best that U.S. liberalism has had to offer. He supported revolutionary action and oppositional politics at key junctures, beginning with the Liberty Party and the radical abolitionists, and then the mass anti-slavery movement that began to develop in 1854, and John Brown, of course. These movements that he was a part of led to the election of a president in 1860 committed to stopping the expansion of slavery, which opened the road to immediate and uncompensated abolition, a revolutionary end. Douglass fought for and he helped recruit the Black Liberation Army that played a leading role in making that revolutionary end reality. But Douglass's liberal worldview also included a defense of private property, a harmony of interests between capital and labor, a defense of bourgeois Republican institutions, and equality before the law. In our opinion, a mixed bag of progressive and, over time, less progressive ideas. And where he fell on a scale of political ideology, we think it's important to note, depends on what phase of Douglass's life we're examining. Under the tutelage of William Lloyd Garrison, we might call Douglass a pacifist proto-anarchist whose method was moral suasion. More recently, scholars have really debated what type of a liberal Douglass was, either a classical liberal or a reform liberal. And political traditions running from libertarianism to liberals to social democrats all claim Douglass as their own for one reason or another.
Right.
But from the early 1850s through the Civil War, the main bulk of our study, August and I refer to him as a revolutionary liberal for reasons I mentioned and reasons I'm sure we'll discuss further. And then after the war ended, which my article, which you mentioned, examines the classical side of Douglass's liberalism intensified when he remained silent about land confiscation and preached class collaboration, while oftentimes siding with bosses against workers in labor disputes. but ultimately he played a historic role in the world historic struggle to end slavery in the United States, and fighters for a more just world stand on his shoulders.
Yeah, I call that. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's talk about the Paris Commune later. That's a good ending point. Let's start at the beginning, if you will, for both these men. The 1848 revolutions. They both were acute observers of what was going on. Marx is even a participant in some sense. I think it's fascinating that both men were, as your sources point out, journalists. And they could. And this is August's whole argument. The real time political analysis, and it works out so well. How do you set this book up? They event after event after event, key events that they both made observations that helped to define them for the readers, and then also contrast. But let's start. The event that I'm most familiar with is Chartism. The event trying to promote universal suffrage or greater suffrage. That's part of the argument in Great Britain. Let's show how they took different roles and supported different objectives in that campaign.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Douglass, after his first autobiography, outed himself more or less as a fugitive from slavery. And then as part of promoting his book and to remove himself to safety from potential slave catchers, Douglass took a trip to the United Kingdom, traveled around the islands, the various countries for 16 months, I believe, between 1846 and 1847. And there he came in contact, as you say, with the Chartist movement, the mostly working class movement for political rights in the United Kingdom. As Douglass's one of his earlier biographers, William McFeely, says, Douglass reached, and this is under the guidance of Garrison, he reached up to the middle and upper class layers of abolitionism in the UK, as opposed to out to fellow workers. Douglass was recently a laborer then. And so Douglass got in touch, organized more with what was called the moral force wing of the Chartists. These were more middle class reformers. They were opposed to what they called physical force, that some of the more radical wings of the working class movement in the UK were part of. So this is who Douglass cut his teeth with in politics, so to speak. He was certainly inspired, we argue, by their fight for political rights, their fight for the right to vote. It really expanded his thinking. But again, yeah, he was affiliated with the more middle class version of this political movement.
And it's also important to point out that Marx makes his first visit to England not long before, long after Douglass had been there. And Marx encounters the Chartists also, but Marx has a very different reaction. For Marx, the Chartists, the working class component of the Chartists, is very, very inspiring. Up until then, the revolutionary potential of the proletariat for Marx had been much more abstract. But by going to England and meeting the Chartists, the working class Chartists, it put some meat on the bones and some concreteness to the working class and working class proletariat. So Marx comes back very inspired by having met the Chartists, the working class Chartists.
Yeah, one of your observations is that Douglass held back from supporting violence as a means to advance suffrage. And I was wondering, he comes into the abolition movement kind of as being mentored by William Lloyd Garrison, who I think, as Kyle said, is an anarchist or pacifist. They called it perfectionism back there, and he almost had to unlearn that as his as he goes on. But perhaps that influences his attitude toward what was happening in the Chartist movement.
I think so, yes. I think maybe moving a half step forward, what really influenced him in terms of violence, I think, were the revolutions of 1848 and the French Revolution specifically, abolishing slavery in their colonies. After his break with William Lloyd Garrison and founding the North Star, he came back and he wrote that the revolution in France has aroused the world from its stupor. It convinced Douglass that it was possible to unite the anti-slavery forces in America into one mighty phalanx to bring down the haughty citadel of slavery. And it was that next year, in about 1849, that he really started to move away from pacifism, writing that I recognize in the southern states at this moment a state of war. This was kind of John Brown language. But then he also said, at least one colored man in the Union, peaceman though he is, still describing himself as a peaceman, would greet with joy the glad news that an insurrection had broken out in the southern states. This emboldened Douglass to say that abolitionists might hail the news of a slave insurrection, something he had totally spoken out against. He said he would never support a slave insurrection, even if it meant freeing the slaves. But it was, though, different then when the working class in Europe went into motion. Those initial democratic Republican revolutions of February 1848 inspired workers across the continent and in the UK. In April, the Chartists attempted to organize a massive demonstration inspired by the movement in France, but Douglass came out against this in his paper. He wrote that while liberty of speech is allowed in the constitutional monarchy of the UK, while the freedom of the press is permitted and the right of petition is respected, when men are left free to originate reforms without, and members are left free to propose and advocate them within the walls of Parliament, no excuse can be valid for resorting to the fearful use of brute force and bloodshed. And then in Paris in June 1848, after the workshops or the employment program was shut down by the newly formed Republican government, there was a mass working class uprising. And Douglass, though, came out against this again. He denounced these as wild and wicked means of anarchy and bloodshed, and came out specifically against the communists of Paris, who are chiefly responsible for this last confused scene of human slaughter. This would be foreshadowing. This, I think, was part of Douglass's being from 1848 until his post-war career. And obviously, as August has done so much work on, Marx and Engels had a different perspective during this time.
Yes. Yeah. I'm real familiar with the Douglass's friendships that he formed in Great Britain, some of which persisted through his entire life into the 1880s and 1890s. He revisited England on his second honeymoon. But what you're pointing out is that the people who he had this close connections with were largely Quaker, very bourgeois, some actually rather wealthy. John Bright was a very important figure for him, and you can place him in a political spectrum just so far to the left, maybe very comparable to Douglass, supporting reform up to a certain point, but definitely running into limitations. Yeah, it's fascinating. This international perspective you brought in through that is very, very useful for reinterpreting or rethinking basic issues about Douglass and where his ideas were most formed by.
In the 1848 revolutions, Jack, as you know, had a big impact on liberal causes in the United States. Seneca Falls, as you know, is one of the products of the 1848 revolution. So yes,
interesting. All right. Yeah. I wonder. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she came from pretty wealthy background there. I don't know how far she was going. She's probably similar to Douglass. There's a limit from her bourgeois perspective there. let's talk about, let's shift a little bit because we have so many topics. You know, Douglas had spent time in Ireland, and we probably have listeners from Ireland. But when Douglas returns to the United States after that first visit to England, he often encountered significant opposition from Irish Americans. It was a great disappointment to him. Daniel O'Connor had really sponsored Douglas in when he was living in Ireland, and supported the cause of emancipation. But back in the United States, Irish Americans held back from doing that. In fact, we're often aligned against emancipation. Now, you would guys address that, I think, pretty effectively in your own study. But maybe we should get into this. It's been a controversial issue among scholars for decades. David Roediger used to be a colleague of mine at the Douglass Papers. We started on the same day many years ago at the Douglass Papers. I stayed, and Dave left after about 5 months. It wasn't for him, and whatever happened to him,
he didn't tell me that.
He just disappeared after all that. But David has had a lot of thoughts about Irish Americans and white, let's just say racism. But I think you guys re-examined that in a very interesting way that maybe we should go dig a little deeper into.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, well, while Douglas was in Ireland, that's when he came the closest himself to kind of rethinking the black slavery versus white slavery debate.
Hmm.
Douglas was always clear that the slavery that black folks were experiencing in the United States was of a different quantity, a qualitatively different level than the oppression that white laborers felt, wage workers were dealing with, or colonial subjects, even like the Irish. But seeing the poverty in Ireland, seeing their oppression, he didn't come over. He didn't make an equal sign between there, but it was the closest he came to saying, "Wow, this may be a form of slavery as well." And he also had, his own attitudes that were fairly normal for the 1860s or excuse me, the 1840s about kind of the Irish question. He blamed a lot of the Irish poverty on intemperance, on drinking. He was a temperance supporter as well.
Right. Yeah.
Instead of seeing this as a symptom of their oppression, he saw it as a cause. But he didn't experience racial prejudice in Ireland. As you said, he was sponsored by these leaders of the Irish fight. But back in the United States, Irish Americans had some of the worst prejudices in the country. But he was clear, like I mentioned, he said in the 1850s, this was taught to these Irish immigrants. This wasn't something inherent in them as Irish people or anything like this. This was stirred up as a way to create divisions within the laboring classes, between slaves and poor whites in the United States. So that was a really important thing for Douglas to examine and to explain, and we think he did so in the correct way.
Yeah, we think he could also reflect back on his experiences as an enslaved person working on the docks in Baltimore, and his experience. Those were also then to go to Ireland and realize, no, this is not there's something going on here within the United States, as opposed to what he encountered in Ireland. Just a footnote, Frederick, not the other Frederick Ingalls, also was very much affected by the Irish question. And his first book on the conditions of the working class in Manchester and so on. In fact, it was the Irish struggle for self-determination that helped to radicalize Ingalls and it was two sisters, the Burns sisters, Irish nationalists, had a real big impact on Ingalls and his radicalization.
Let's test that. As I said, I was really interested in this, what you call the real-time political analysis. The comparisons side by side, and you guys concluded that Marx had a a more accurate assessment of where the Republican Party, once it got started, even before the Civil War, but definitely during the Civil War, that was going to be pursue emancipation, while Douglass maintained doubts. I don't think he actually voted for Abraham Lincoln, or he didn't campaign for Lincoln at all in '60, and was almost ready not to do it in 1864, but finally came along. Maybe you could explain why, Douglass, why was Douglass short-sighted in this, not realizing the potential that was at hand?
Well, maybe Kyle, you should go talk about Douglass, and then I'll talk about why Marx had
Okay.
a different response. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just in general, through the 1850s, Douglas's political formula in presidential elections was to initially endorse the candidate of the principled or pure abolitionist party. And then as the election drew closer, he would switch his support to the lesser evil anti-slavery coalition party. In 1852, that was the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party in 1856. In 1860, however, like you mentioned, he inverted this. He first praised Lincoln as fully committed to the doctrine of the irrepressible conflict, compared to Seward's more recent temporizing after his nomination at Chicago. But then, as the election approached, he wrote that he would sincerely hope for the Republican victory. He knew that the slaveholders couldn't countenance it, but he would cast his own vote for the radical abolitionist candidate, Gerrit Smith. And I think David Blight wrote something really important about this. At that time, the Republicans seemed to, quote, both despise and champion his people. In New York, there was a ballot measure to give Black people equal voting rights. There was a property qualification for Blacks. The Republicans were at best lukewarm, and at worst outright opponents of equal rights for Black voters. And Douglass also believed that the Republican platform fell short. Their platform was no more slave states as opposed to death to slavery. And then he also attended in September 1860 one of these radical abolitionist conventions. So I believe the combination of those factors discouraged him from voting or campaigning for Lincoln in 1860. And yeah, this was the most momentous election the country had ever seen. And Douglass didn't aid in the Republican victory.
With regard to Marx, Jack, the brief answer can be found, I think, in the last page of the Communist Manifesto, in Part 4 in the Communist Manifesto. The task for communists in countries, in the various countries in which they operate. And in that almost penultimate paragraph, quote, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. That was the Republican Party.
Yeah.
That was the Republican Party. So for Marxists and for communists, and that was a test. Once the Republican Party comes into existence, once it's instituted and so on, the Communist League members, Marxist comrades who had migrated to the United States, they immediately jumped on board. They immediately jumped on board the Republican Party. They were faithful, had no doubts about it, because in the reality of that was the Revolutionary Party.
Yeah, I mean, Douglass has usually said he's a pragmatist in politics. I mean, look at compared to the Democrats, of course, the Republicans were the Republican Party, but again, sometimes his judgment, or maybe he wanted more from the Republicans than he thought they could get. I don't know. That's fascinating, but you're definitely right that American Marxists, clearly lined up in support of the Republican Party and supported Lincoln very, very faithfully during the whole war. Now, you guys have this great chapters comparing the war, the phases of the war, almost you have two journalists, and they're both writing often about exactly the same events, and so it's a great tool. What do they think of McClellan? What do they think of the Battle of Antietam? You line this up and explain how each of these individuals' political perspectives affect their judgment on each of these single events, and it works very well. And sometimes it shows some flaws in some Douglas's judgment, but you often find them coming together and agreeing on more and more issues. One of which was they both were very excited about events in Great Britain during the war. Right? They maybe we should for our friends watching us from England, we should talk about how they both looked at the attitudes of English leaders, great British leaders toward the American Revolution, the American Civil War, as it progressed 1861, 62, 63.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Douglas, as I believe I mentioned earlier, he recognized that European elites were giving backhanded support to the Confederacy. And Douglas initially argued, he blamed this on Lincoln, saying he was reluctant to move against slavery. That's why they had this cover to support the Confederacy. And Marx had to explain how that was backwards. And yes, Douglas really focused on at first the elite behavior, the behavior of the elites like Palmerston, Bonaparte in France. He gave that priority, where of course Marx was organizing in the working class at the time. The revolutionary movement in America was bringing Marx back into politics, and August can say more about this, but the revolutionary sentiment of the working class in the UK there, even though that they were thrown out of work because of the embargo on the cotton trade, they were devoutly supportive of the Union and unwilling to go along with the press and with the political leaders of the time. But that, and then yeah, so August, talk a little bit more about Marx and his what he was doing journalistically.
Just one thing, we had a bit of a methodological issue we had to grapple with, Jack, in that Marx had an advantage that Douglas didn't in terms of the journalism. Douglas's paper was a monthly.
That's
and
true.
Things were moving pretty quickly at times and so on.
Yeah,
and Marx had the advantage of writing for a daily. So in
yeah.
some ways he could get out and react to things much quicker than Douglas could. So we had to take that into account, especially around the Trent affair, in which Washington came close, a war between both Britain and Washington around this incident that took place at sea. But yeah, so Marx, with the advantage of a daily, writing for the Daily Tribune, he could respond to developments much more quicker, much sooner. Some developments that we think, we can't prove it, we think that Marx's intervention may have been decisive in some ways in helping to prevent war between Britain and the United States. I just wanted to interject that into the conversation. Yeah, Marx had the difficult position of defending Lincoln, despite Lincoln not calling this a war against slavery, just a war to end secession. So Marx was in the difficult position of defending Lincoln, whereas Douglas tended to blame Lincoln for the problems. What do you call it? He was the reason why the elite were giving that backhanded support to the Confederacy, because it was Lincoln's fault for not having declared this a war against slavery. So Marx is he had to drop everything, by the way. One of the things about he was one of the reasons why the Capitol Project never got completed, One of the reasons why Capital never was completed by Marx, because Marx had to drop that project in order to get up to speed on U.S. history. That's a whole other side, a fascinating side about Marx.
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of historians and scholars like Robert Levine, somebody I'm familiar with, has noticed that Douglas's attitude toward Lincoln shifted many times, almost with who he's talking to, literally to an audience, while Marx is much more consistent, right? Let's hear about what Marx thought about Lincoln.
Yeah, also too, it's important to, one of the things we discover is that Douglas and Ingalls was also very pessimistic about Lincoln. Ingalls was also, in many ways, Ingalls and Douglas were more in agreement on Lincoln than with Marx. Our book documents something that's been missing in Marxist scholarship, as far as I know. The only documented debate between Marx and Ingalls, which lasted for almost 3 years, was over the Civil War and the conduct of the Lincoln administration's conduct of the war. That was, it's the only, it lasts, and it's very important because it means that just because both of them shared a historical materialist framework, a historical materialist framework could only be a broad outline. In other words, it could not be a template for making sense of day-to-day reality. That's what we think we're able to demonstrate, and especially for a Marxist scholarship, for those who debate about historical materialism. Here we have two individuals, founders of historical materialism, and the disagreements they had about how to apply it.
Yeah, I think August at one point described it as Marx having a telescopic view of this conflict, whereas Douglas had a microscopic view. It was obviously so personal to Douglas. It was so close to home for Douglas. It's not his fault. We're not trying to criticize him innately or anything like this. But as you mentioned, yeah, Douglas's assessment of Lincoln during the war went through these wild swings. As soon as the war broke out, Douglas spoke and wrote incessantly in favor of transforming the war from one to defend the 1860 election or the Union more generally into an abolition war by freeing the slaves and organizing them into the Union Army. And it took Lincoln 18 months to do this. Those must have been agonizing months for Douglas. But once Lincoln introduced the gradual and compensated emancipation plans, things that look almost timid in our eyes today, successfully he did so in D.C. This led to jubilation from Douglas. But next, Lincoln's meeting with the D.C. clergymen, where he seemed to blame the war on Black people and where he advocated colonization again, Douglas went into a fury. Finally, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation came out in September 1862. Douglas says he then shouted for joy. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this to Douglas was the most important of any order to which any president of the United States ever signed his name. And then from there forward, other than a brief flirtation with Fremont in 1864, Douglas came to view Lincoln as much as the black man's president as the white man's president. So yeah, I think the way that August described this to me, this telescopic metaphor compared to the microscopic, I think explains a lot.
Analogy, yeah.
From operating from 4,000 miles away.
Yes.
Douglas might have been too close.
I see that. It's very, very, very insightful. Let's remember. What do you think of this idea? I think for Lincoln, the goal of the war probably was achieved with the 13th Amendment. For Douglas, the goal, he is still, the 14th and 15th Amendment kind of bring his war or his movement, his revolution, all right, to its culmination, right? And you guys, and so we're kind of pushing to Reconstruction a little bit, which you do address kind of as the afterward to your main study. But I thought there's a lot of good material in there that to Douglas achieving the ballot for the African American, and he would have liked it for all African Americans, but at least the African American male through the 15th Amendment was really the culmination of what he thought he had struggled for, what he did struggle for all those decades since he escaped from slavery. But you have a pretty good critique of that, and even Douglass maybe had some second thoughts later in his life as well.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Just to restate, yeah, we argue that Douglass was a revolutionary due in part, in a big part, to him recruiting for the Union Army. Some scholars have said that because Douglass didn't join Brown at Harper's Ferry, he never considered actual mass revolution as an option to contest the violence of the slave market. We think that neglects Douglass's real revolutionary role. But yeah, as far back as the 1840s, he keyed in on universal suffrage as the keystone or the panacea. And when the 15th Amendment was passed, Douglass was saying to crowds that, this means we've done it. The black man can now be on his own, and it's good that he is. He said he told an audience that the colored people are now and will be held to be by the whole nation responsible for their own existence, for ill or for good. Gaining the right to vote means that we are placed upon an equal footing with all other men. The glory or the shame will be ours. But of course, the way that Reconstruction unfolded left the freed people without the means or the power to effectuate their freedom. Yes, Douglass was silent on the question that was most important. This was the land question, confiscation and redistribution. Yes, for him, I think we argue that his revolutionary career ends with the 15th Amendment, with the passage of the right to vote.
One of the advantages that Marx had, Jack, is always important to remember, unlike Douglass. Marx had gone through a revolution, the 1848-1849 revolution. The lessons of that revolution. One, that revolution taught him about the importance of military tactics, strategy, what happens on the battlefield. There was nothing in Douglass's background about warfare and what happens in a war. That was an advantage. There was a political advantage that Marx and Engels had too. They learned about the limitations about elections, the limitations of elections. The first elections that took place in Germany in 1849, they advocated participating in those elections and so on, but not as an independent working class, but aligning themselves with the petty bourgeois left. And once they were betrayed, once the working class was betrayed, that had an important lesson for Marx and Engels, and you see much more sobriety on their part about the reality of elections, what elections can and cannot do. Yeah. There was simply nothing in Douglass's background with that. So the importance of revolutionary experience, the importance and how we all learn, that's how Marx and Engels were able to learn. And simply, it's just a fact that Douglass did not have those kinds of experiences, that kind of a head start program, as we might call it.
That's very good, because in later decades, Douglass does reflect back, and probably he learned that lesson painfully with the events of the 1880s and 1890s, that more should have been done when there was that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a speech sometime in the 1880s that was then republished in his final autobiography in 1893, where yes, he reflected back and he said that the Republicans' Reconstruction policy was fatal for this project, and he named Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner as two more revolutionary leaders that they should have listened to. But yeah, Douglass ended up being, to use a term that Gregory Downes has coined, a bloody constitutionalist. This describes liberal revolutionaries who, after the end of hostilities, shunned stern duties and feared a more progressive march from the bourgeois to the proletarian revolution. And there's been a lot of historical scholarship Heather Cox Richardson comes to
Yeah,
mind,
very good.
that has shown, in addition to the racist reactionary terror that Black people endured in the South, another reason for the failure of Reconstruction was liberals who again um, were frightened by the potential of a transracial alliance between poor whites, newly freed people, poor farmers, and that was a part of the reason for the pullback away from these what Marx would call stern duties afterwards.
Yeah, we've discussed this once earlier. I always wondered why Douglas didn't support land reform with when it was current in Congress. I don't know why he wasn't aware of it, why he didn't speak out about it. We just there isn't any record. He doesn't speak out against it, but he certainly could have been a stronger advocate for it, and that opportunity passed.
And in
You know,
making,
no, go ahead, Alex.
yeah, I was just going to say, in making that criticism that we do, we don't think it's Monday morning quarterbacking. We don't think it's hindsight, because there was a slave owner, a former slave owner, who we came across towards the end of our research, named Charles Hopkins. He was a unionist, supported. He called for redistribution of land, dividing up the plantations and so on. And there's an interview that he did in November of 1865, and he told the interviewer, a northern newspaper, give a man a piece of land, let him have a cabin of his own upon his own lot, and then you make him free. Civil rights are good for nothing. The ballot is good for nothing till you make some men of every class landholders. That's in November 1865. So in other words, yeah, it isn't as if the necessity of a land reform only becomes clear later.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I think your explanations. I've looked at Douglas. This is an overlooked facet of his resume. He was a labor leader for a year. He was the president of the National Labor Union. It's called by historians the coward National Labor Union because it was simultaneous with a predominantly white group. But yeah, the platform that Douglas advanced for this group was not uh, almost not pro-union in some ways. He largely complaining about the existing unions' failure to open their membership to African Americans, and that. But also, as I think Kyle mentioned earlier, uh, still professing this belief that the fundamental needs of employers and employees are really very, very similar. They should work together. And guess in Douglas' case, if they could just get past the racism, that they could advance together. It does sound a little naive,
But
but I think
yes,
your
yeah,
explanations are good.
yeah, and of course, Douglas's complaints about the unions, the white unions at the time, were just and they were accurate. The National Labor Union came to the Colored National Labor Union with the idea of a labor party, but they would not advocate entry within their organization of black workers into their unions. So there was this schism where many of the Colored National Labor Union leaders, representatives, were from more middle class backgrounds. There wasn't, yet a growing industrial working class among black people. They were teachers, lawyers, journalists like Douglas, who were leading this Colored National Labor Union. So there was a problem of class position. But of course, there was just the massive problem that Marx, of course, identified as white labor continuing to continuing to be infected with prejudice against black workers. And it was, I don't, ships passing in the night isn't the right analogy, but they were talking past each other on a lot of these major issues.
One thing
Yeah,
I just thinking about, Kyle, that we should have maybe been more explicit about, but in 1859 in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, that's the famous phrase about being determines consciousness. Being determines consciousness. We come close to saying that in explaining Douglass. That is his reality. He was a small businessman. His
yeah.
class reality. His class reality, in other words, I think goes a long way in explaining why his limitations.
Yeah.
Being determines consciousness.
I live with a lot of his correspondence, and much of it is he's a landlord complaining about certain tenants, and very very upset that they're not maintaining the property as well as he'd like.
Yep.
All of us who have been tenants know that relationship there. It's fascinating. Well, let's kind of go to the present, if you will, and maybe this puts some perspective on Douglass and maybe on American historians, because Douglass, and maybe I'm generalizing too much, but sees racism as the fundamental flaw in America. Well, I don't think you guys or Karl Marx would have agreed with that. That was not that it wasn't a flaw, but it wasn't the most fundamental flaw that needed attention, even in Douglass's time, and of course since. How do you react to that?
Well, in our book, to bring this up to the present, we address, for example, the 1619 project today. And that project, we think, needs to try and explain why the suffrage hasn't delivered racial equality, as heroic reformers like Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr. argued it would. They point to systematic racism, or as it was articulated in that introductory essay, that racism is in the DNA of white Americans, often specifically targeted at white workers. In Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, she said that the deplorables were irredeemable. Almost worse than the name calling for us would be this concept of being irredeemable. We'd think Douglass would have been opposed to that. We argue instead, via W.E.B. Du Bois, that, quote, democratic life cannot flourish as long as it is bound and shaped around hierarchies of status. Du Bois taught that it was a counter-revolution of property as much as a white counter-revolution that killed Reconstruction. And we're still working out these contradictions between the revolution of 1863, if you will, and the counter-revolution that followed. But as Malcolm X explained, and this was assisted, we think, by the material changes in the United States, where the black labor was finally subsumed into U.S. industry, which gave him a perspective that wasn't available to Douglass. But he said, you can't have capitalism without racism. More recently, Keeanga Yamada Taylor has written, what is the system behind systemic racism? It's capitalism. So yeah, we would argue that today, never before has the working class been as integrated across racial, gender, or immigration status. The objective conditions are present for the needed struggle for human emancipation. And just to give two short personal anecdotes, if I could, in 2023, for example, I joined a picket line of striking General Motors workers just west of Minneapolis. A telling part of the rally to me was that there were two multi-generational speakers, two families that spoke. One father was black and had a son who worked at the parts center where we were at. The other father was white and had a daughter who worked at the same place. To me, it showed the potential of our class when it comes to a hereditary proletariat, multiracial, multigender, willing to fight together. And maybe most people my age would take that for granted, this white family and this black family together on the picket line. But August can tell it better than me. This wasn't the case. This is a new phenomenon in the working class. Even more recently, just last week, the Teamsters, food service, janitorial, landscape workers, and others at the University of Minnesota, where August and I work, were on strike. These picket lines included white workers, Black Americans, and recent immigrants. A large part of the workforce are recent immigrants from East Africa, men and women. They struck together, and with a crucial solidarity action from union workers and farmers involved with Farm Aid, Farmers Benefit Concert, they won the demands of their strike in the face of divisive and intimidating tactics from their employers. And these are rumblings, baby steps towards the general upsurge we need that can lead to human emancipation. So I wouldn't say that racism is less important, less of an issue than capitalism, but we have to figure out which is a symptom and which is the root cause.
Even at the end of his life, if you may notice, Jack, we begin the book with Martin Luther King. King is grappling with that question at the end of his life.
Yes.
And he comes to the conclusion that there can never be racial inequality in the United States unless there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. We think those conditions for that radical redistribution of economic and political power, we don't know what King had in mind, but we think the conditions are better than ever for bringing that about. We also recognize too, and it's not inevitable. The word inevitable only appears once in the Communist Manifesto, only once, immediately followed by instructions about what the working class has to do. And we see our book as a contribution to those instructions.
Good, very good. Well, I see that our time is coming to an end. I'd like to thank both of you and just observe. I was talking with another author, a different show, and both books have brought excellent new perspectives to our understanding of Frederick Douglass. And it is, as I stated then, and I think at the beginning of this interview, there was a huge proliferation of studies of Douglass on his 200th birthday, but you folks have helped demonstrate that there's still new perspectives that can be brought to studying the old field of Frederick Douglass, and new insights can come forward from this. And we will see Douglass in new ways, I think, as a result of that. I know it's definitely helped my research and my understanding of Frederick Douglass. And of course, we live in a very difficult historical moment, don't we now? We hope that Douglass's achievements, even if some people might think they were limited or could have been greater, are still very significant to dealing with fundamental problems in our country. And I hope that we can all make that argument stronger and louder, and overcome the voices that kind of want to dismiss all of these true early American heroes. It's a difficult moment we're living through. Yes. Well, again, thank you again, both of you, for your great contribution to the study of Frederick Douglass.
We really appreciate this, Jack. Yeah, again, it would have been impossible without the Frederick Douglass Papers, without your help. And thank you very much for organizing this. It was a real pleasure.
And we look forward to the final volume.
Well, what I really look for is what you were talking about with the comprehensive digital volume. That is what.
All right. Well, I'm not retiring anytime soon.
Very good.
Though,
wonderful.
We'll keep on struggling.
Good.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much, Jack, August, and Kyle, for such a rich and thought-provoking discussion today. I think the conversation really has, as you said, Jack, given us a deeper understanding of how both Douglass and Marx grappled with, the meaning of freedom, revolution, democracy, and so many other topics during the Civil War and, in their time, and how their insights continue to resonate and shape our time. And of course, I'm also delighted to hear references to Ireland and Douglass's time in Ireland, since Douglass Week began in Ireland, and we are celebrating the 180th anniversary of his journey there this year. So it's a special year. And I look forward to reading your book. Definitely really excited. Again, guys, thank you so much. Your book, The Communist and the Revolutionary Liberal in the Second American Revolution, is out, and we'll link it here on YouTube so everyone can go check it out as well. And thank you again on the behalf of the Douglass Week team. Thank you for your time. Thank you to everyone watching today and joining us. And I look forward to welcoming you back to Douglass Week, hopefully very, very soon. So happy Douglass Week, y'all, and have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.